Okay, so Hanukkah is actually tomorrow night, and let's just to do what we haven't done. Okay, so it says how to light. You light from left to right, which is the first candle is going to be even for the new night. For the new night, you put the new candle on the left, and the one on the right, and you light the one on the left. On the left first, because that's the new candle to signify the new night. Okay, and there's the brocha, which I don't have to go through, which you know. And you say Ma'oz Tzura in the okay. So there's a picture. I can't make this bigger. I don't know if you guys can see that.
So the bottom, if you click on the plus sign right at the bottom on the right hand corner, you can make it bigger. Yeah, just drag it across.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so first night, you're going to put one candle at the end, at the end of. I don't know if this is facing front or backwards, because it. So you put it on, and then you light that. Then light two, you add this one first, then you put that one. So you light this one first because it's the light for the second night. Yeah, it's for the first night. Then you light the one which signifies the first night. So this is for second night. You light first, and then the following one the next wick you light is this one here. So it's always on the left. So this is second night. So there are two then. Okay, and I think I'm going to send this to you guys. It's eighth night. Then you know eighth night. So you light there. Then you write the following 7 in the sequence from there right unto there. Okay, and then during davening, I'll just add this. Every day in Shacharit, you actually do Hallel, the full Hallel, and you don't do Musaf though. So it's actually very interesting. You do Hallel, but you don't do you don't do Musaf like you do in Rosh Chodesh. But
there is Torah reading though. There is Torah reading.
Torah reading every day, but you do Hallel, but no Musaf. So Shacharit, Hallel, Torah reading. That's it. No Musaf, which you get on Rosh Chodesh. I don't know if you guys. I'm sure you know of that, but that's for Shacharit davening. There's no Musaf, just Hallel. Because Hallel is usually when we do Hallel, it's usually Rosh Chodesh and the Chagim. You always do a Musaf with Hallel, so it's a bit of an interesting exception. That's it. So okay, I think that's about it. So it's tomorrow night, starts first night, and I think we've gone through everything or most things. I can send you this text. I just pulled it from Shechianu, because let's just reduce the size of this. Shechianu, you say. I don't know if it's only the first night. Let's see, first night. Okay, and on Shabbos, Shechianu, when do you say this? Only the first time. The first time, like if you're lighting tomorrow night, you only say it tomorrow night. Then and for Shabbos, sorry, I didn't touch on this. Shabbos, you actually have to, light. You have to put enough oil or have a long enough candle so it burns into the night. So if you're coming home and you light pre-Shabbos, Erev Shabbos, so the Hanukkah lights, if you're at home during the week, you may half an hour is enough if you're at home and you're at home the whole time. But if you're at shul, by the time you get home, they're going to be out. They're going to be extinguished. So you need to have extra oil for Shabbos night. So when you get home, you can see that it's lit. Okay, I think that's about all.
All right, guys. So what we dealt with the last session, we were all a bit exhausted, but there were some little subtleties. So, I mean, we ended up knowing that basically we wanted to determine that a person that found a lost object, are they deemed a paid custodian or an unpaid custodian? And obviously, Rav Yosef adopted the position that being a paid custodian, that basically an armed robber would be classified as a thief, and therefore if he was stolen from, there was a twofold payment necessary, because that was a buyer's counter argument. So now they challenged it from the following brisa. We got this, but I wanted to just obviously grab the subtlety of what's involved. Now, before the brisa comes into play, there's a discussion that occurs in Exodus, Shmot, chapter 22, verse 7. I did open it up in Sepharia, but unfortunately, Sepharia doesn't really give a lot of detail in English. And it's a discussion in the Gemara in Bava Kamma 41b. Okay? And what it says is that as far as a unpaid custodian is concerned, that was seeming to be the example. Like I couldn't arrive if the Chumash was talking about custodians in general, would mention the example of an unpaid custodian in the Chumash. That much I couldn't deduce. But what I could deduce is that nevertheless you would derive it from a kol v'chomer, because this was the discussion that was given, is that an unpaid custodian is basically having to pay for any damage that happens to an article if he misappropriated its use. What do we mean misappropriated its use? It means he used it in his personal capacity when his job was really to do what, guys? To look after it, right? And therefore, if it gets damaged within that use, even through, what do we call it? Even through something unpredictable or unavoidable, he becomes liable at the point where he partook of its use, which he was not entitled to do so. Does that make sense, guys? So what we're saying is that rule was very straightforward with even in the Chumash with regards to an unpaid custodian. Okay, but what do we determine in terms of a paid custodian? Is what? Guys, what did we say the other day?
But the paid custodian has more responsibility because he's getting paid.
Correct. So exactly as Gavin said, but let's follow this logic through. Okay, let's follow this logic through as follows. Is in the beginning, let me just tell you how this worked. Is that Rav Yosef's opinion was challenged by a buyer. Okay, I'm just doing a review with you. And he said, look, I know you see a person that found a lost object as a paid custodian. But what are you going to do with Rav Chia bar Abba, who said in the name of Rav Yochanan, one who asserts a claim of theft by a thief with respect to a lost object that he found, when in fact he has stolen it himself, is liable for the twofold payment? Because if you think that one who watches a lost object is treated as a paid custodian, as you do, Rav Yosef, why does he pay the twofold payment? He should, in fact, become liable to pay the principal immediately, even if his claim is true. So what this is saying is, according to Rav Chia bar Abba and Rav Yochanan, is that a thief is actually treated as an unpaid custodian. Why? Because if he's caught lying that somebody stole his goods, he would have to pay the twofold payment because he's treated as the thief is. So that's a proof by a buyer to Rav Yosef that he's actually an unpaid custodian, not a paid custodian. So a buyer is saying to Rav Yosef, well, what do you say to that? And if you remember, Rav Yosef is saying, look, what case are we dealing with here? We're dealing with the case where a claim of theft is made by an armed bandit, meaning that it is it's basically an unavoidable mishap. And even a paid custodian is not liable for unavoidable mishap. In other words, I'm saying, Rav Yosef is saying, I'm saying that a paid custodian is off the hook, not for loss or theft, but for something like robbery, because it's an unavoidable mishap. It's nothing that he could have prevented by him looking after it. So therefore, he's off the hook. And then Abai says to Rav Yosef, look, there's a problem, because we know that an unpaid custodian just has to take an oath, and he's not responsible for loss or theft. But what are you talking about here? Because a robber, a gazlan, is different to a thief. Why is it different to a thief? A ganef is because a thief stealthily steals because he doesn't want the public to know he's a thief, and therefore he's embarrassed about people's opinion, but he's not embarrassed about what Hashem thinks of him, and therefore he has to pay double, whereas a robber is probably oblivious to what all people think of him, and therefore he doesn't have to pay a double payment. It's not disrespectful to Hashem. The guy's just generally disrespectful to everybody. It's not a special thing reserved for Hashem. And therefore, it's not seen in the same light. So Abai is saying to Rav Yosef, look, that's my arguments against you, is that you can't call an armed robber a thief. An armed robber is basically an unavoidable mishap. I agree with you. But then you don't have to pay the double payment. In other words, a paid custodian, if anything gets lost or stolen, he just has to pay the principal. There's no discussion, there's no oath. An unpaid custodian gets off the hook for anything lost or stolen unless it's negligence, and only has to have an oath that it was stolen from him, then he gets off the hook. But here, the paid custodian is saying, no, I was robbed by an armed bandit, and therefore all I have to do is do the oath, and then I'm off the hook, which is fine, because that's an unavoidable accident. But then basically Abai is saying to Rav Yosef, but hang on a second, you can't say a armed bandit is the same category as a thief, because that's an unavoidable mishap. So you can't put it in, and we'd already discussed that Rav Yosef said no. I say a thief and an armed bandit are the same. Why? Because they're both considered thieves. I mean, picture this. Somebody's robbing you, right? They wear a mask. Otherwise, they're going to end up hanging from a tree by the sheriff of the court. So he also sneaks around. There's no difference. So therefore, it's a decent argument. So number one, he has to adopt the position that an armed robber is classified as a thief, and that one who watches a lost object is a paid custodian. Okay? And that it has to be an armed bandit. Why does it have to be an armed bandit? Because he gets off under an unavoidable mishap. That's exactly what he gets off, not under theft or things that are stolen. My argument last time, which I think is still valid, but I'm sure they've got a good response, is that, look, if you want to say it's an unavoidable mishap, then you can't say that. In other words, if Rav Yosef is saying that an armed bandit is the same as a thief in terms of his category, then why wouldn't the paid custodian just basically have to pay back the principal? How's this an argument against Rav Yochanan? Does that make sense? Because it would be in the category of theft. In other words, you can't play double games. You can't say Rav Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rav Yochanan that in that particular case, one who finds a lost object is treated as an unpaid custodian, because he would have to pay, if he was caught stealing, he'd have to pay the double payment. And then Rav Yosef saying he's basically a thief, same as an armed robber. They're both in the same category, and then say that in that particular case, he's still treated as a paid custodian, because if you treat him as a thief, then he wouldn't make the double payment. It's not an argument against that case. He just paid the principal. So that's the issue I have. It hasn't been answered. But so far, that's good in terms of a defense from Rav Yosef. But now they challenged it from the following brisa. So this is a new section now where we've touched on, but there's a complexity to it. Because what's happening is in the Chumash, in Exodus chapter 22, verse 7, is it says, look, in the Chumash it mentions that if a custodian, it just mentions if a custodian makes illicit use of the item in his care, becomes liable for even an unavoidable mishap. Okay? But that's in regard to both an unpaid custodian and a paid custodian. But there's a discussion in Bava Kamma 41b that reasons that it didn't have to be mentioned in connection with the paid custodian in the Chumash, because it could have been derived from logic, just from an unpaid custodian. So obviously in the Chumash it mentions a paid custodian, but why could you have derived it from logic even if it mentioned an unpaid custodian? On the following basis, it could have said by logic, since the unpaid custodian, who's not liable for theft and loss, nevertheless becomes liable for unavoidable mishaps if he misappropriates the item. Then a paid custodian is on a higher level of responsibility, as Gavin said, who is liable for theft and loss, is certainly liable to become responsible for unavoidable mishaps in the event of misappropriation. So in other words, if anybody, paid custodian or unpaid custodian, misappropriates the item for personal use, they're no longer protected under that guard of unavoidable mishaps, at which both the paid custodian and unpaid custodian are off the hook for. Does that make sense? Both of them are on the... Who is responsible for unavoidable mishaps? The borrower, only the borrower. So what it would say is, all I'm saying is it didn't have to... The Brisa is basically saying, this Gemara is basically saying in Bava Kamma that you didn't have to mention paid custodian in the Chumash. Even if you said unpaid custodian, for misappropriation of item, for unavoidable mishaps, you have to pay. You lose that protection. So firstly, you've got the Chumash. And it's saying a paid custodian is more stringent than an unpaid custodian. That's how the Kal V'chomer works. Can everybody tell it back to me before I have a brisa that contradicts it? Yes?
Somebody else?
Okay, I'm gonna say it in one simple sentence. First argument is the Chumash. Okay? In Shemot chapter 22, verse 7, that says that a paid custodian is more stringent than an unpaid custodian. How do we see this? In Bava Kamma 41b, that says, even if you mentioned an unpaid custodian that is responsible for unavoidable mishaps if he misappropriates the item, obviously a paid custodian that's responsible for theft or loss is then responsible for unavoidable mishaps if he misappropriated the item, because he's held to a more stringent level, the paid custodian, compared to an unpaid custodian. Okay? Now, if they never misappropriated the item, both the unpaid custodian and the paid custodian are not responsible for unavoidable mishaps. Only the borrower is. Because the person that is lending the borrower is doing the borrower a massive favor. Whereas even though you're paying a paid custodian and he's doing you a favor by looking after your item, you're still paying him. So he's doing you a favor, but less of a favor. So therefore, he is, because he's still doing you some sort of a favor, he's less responsible than a borrower. But an unpaid custodian is the least responsible because he's gaining nothing in return for helping you. And therefore, you can't hold him as legally liable as even the paid custodian, because otherwise he wouldn't want to help you at all. That's the degree. So the more the person's doing you a favor, the more lenient you are with them. The more you're doing them a favor, the more you legally are entitled to be stringent with them. That's the bottom line. But there's a brisa that contradicts this, and Abai is bringing it now to Rav Yosef as an argument. And the brisa goes as follows. No, if you say that the stringency applies to the unpaid custodian, who also possesses the stringency that he makes the twofold payment, will you say that it applies to the paid custodian who does not make the twofold payment? Again, I'll read it again. No, if you say that the stringency applies to the unpaid custodian, who also possesses the stringency that he makes the twofold payment, will you say that it applies to the paid custodian who does not make the twofold payment? Okay, so the brisa states that the paid custodian does not make the twofold payment for a false claim of theft. But should you think that an armed robber is a thief, it emerges that there is a case where a paid custodian would make the twofold payment, namely where he makes a claim of theft by an armed bandit. So what Abaye is actually saying to Rav Yosef is this is an argument against you, Because what this Bryce is doing is actually, in a way, arguing with the position of the Kal V'Chomer in Bava Metzia in 41b. Because in 41b, it's saying, look, logic tells you a paid custodian is more stringent than an unpaid custodian. This Bryce could never argue with the Chumash, but it's arguing with the Gemara in Bava Metzia 41b. And what it's saying is, no, if you think that a paid custodian is more stringent than an unpaid custodian, and therefore you're applying the Kol V'Chomer of misappropriation of use, I'm saying it's not the case. Because with an unpaid custodian, it's more stringent than a paid custodian, because if you're caught out for theft, of lying, and you actually use the item for your own use, then in that case, you're making a twofold payment, whereas a paid custodian is only paying the principal back. So who's paying more money in this case, guys? The unpaid custodian or the paid custodian?
Unpaid.
Correct.
Unpaid, but normally the unpaid custodian is normally somebody that you trust very well. It's highly unlikely it will end up being more stringent.
Correct.
I mean, this wouldn't happen.
The point of it is, as I can tell you, in my lifetime, I've lent money to people that I haven't gotten back. So just because you trust somebody doesn't mean that they're honest. Anyway, let's move on. Unfortunately, that's not always an argument. Kevin, I wish the world worked like that, but I really wish it did. And you're right, you've got a good heart. It doesn't work like that. Sometimes the people, you can only get, listen to me, Kevin, you can only get conned by people you trust. If you take a look at every con merchant in history, you don't get conned if you don't trust the person. That's a fact.
Because they take advantage of the trust.
You thought the guy's honest or whatever. He says, no, I don't want to charge you. You're going overseas, I'll look after your stuff. Meanwhile, he's got your eye. He's got his eye on your laptop. He's had his eye on your laptop for ages. He doesn't have the money for a laptop. Thought, what an opportunity. So
it's not about, we all know you've got a problem with your bias in your laptop. It's not
exactly. None of you want to steal my laptop. Exactly. It's not worth stealing. Sorry, laptop. They hurt your feelings, laptop. I'm sorry. Okay. So, all right. So, guys, let's get back to the discussion. So, Abaye is arguing against Rav Yosef, and he said, look, if you look at this brisa, it's proving that you make a twofold payment in the case of an unpaid custodian, which is, whereas the paid custodian, you only pay the principal back. So the Bryce is actually arguing with this thing in Bava Metzia, and what it's seeming to strain is an unpaid custodian is more stringent. So therefore, you are turning, which can't be. He's saying this can't be the fact. Why can't this be the fact? Because it says in Bava Metzia 41b that the logic is irrefutable. Is that basically an unpaid custodian is less stringent than a paid custodian, less stringent. And the only way that you can deduce this is that if a paid custodian has to pay for theft or loss, which means, Abaye is saying, that this brisa and the Bava Metzia is coming to prove that a robber, an armed robber, is not seen as a thief. So this argues with Rav Yosef. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to use this, to argue against Rav Yosef and say that, look, this is a case clearly where an armed robber is seen as an unavoidable accident. Okay, and then when it's misappropriated, the paid custodian loses that protection, which means he's seen as a robber and not a thief. That's exactly the argument Abaye's got. Okay.
Why is a thief not considered an unavoidable accident again? Because how does the thing?
No, a robber. You mean an armed robber?
No. I'm saying thief. I've just forgotten.
Okay, so this is the thing, is that for a paid custodian, you see, this is the argument, Gavin, that I had where I didn't understand Rav Yosef either. Because Rav Yosef is claiming the following, right? Let's just go to the step again. He's saying, again, this argument occurred because Rav Yosef said that if you find a lost object, you treat it as a paid custodian. Okay? Abaya is using this proof because he agrees with the Rabbah that Rav Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rav Yochanan that one who asserts a claim of theft by a thief with respect to a lost object that he found, when in fact stole it himself, pays the twofold payment. So this will answer your question. Now, if you should think that one who watches a lost object is treated as a paid custodian, why does he pay the twofold payment? He should become liable to pay the principal immediately, even if his claim is true. So what he's actually saying, a buyer, is that if somebody found a lost object and basically he lied under oath and said, listen, I found all these lost objects of yours. This particular lost object of yours was stolen. And then it's found that he kept it because there was a witness that came past his house 6 months later and found the guy's laptop there, and he knows the guy doesn't have a laptop. He was caught lying. So this is a proof, a buyer saying that the person that found a lost object is seen as an unpaid custodian, because only an unpaid custodian is off the hook for theft or loss. He just has to take an oath. And if he's lying, he pays a twofold payment. If it's a paid custodian, if you consider the finder of a lost object a paid custodian, he just has to replace the laptop. There's no twofold payment. And then what happens is Rav Yosef is turning around to that and saying, listen, I say that you don't have to pay if you're a paid custodian if you were robbed, because that's an unavoidable accident. It's something that a paid custodian doesn't have to pay for. Okay? So buyer said, okay, I hear that. But in that particular case, then why would there be a twofold payment? Because a thief and a robber are two separate people in terms of category. You know what I mean? Only a thief is required, according to the Chumash, to pay double. We read that in the Chumash the other day. So he's saying, look, Rav Yosef is saying, I see an armed robber like a thief. They're both stealthily. The victim doesn't know who they are because the guy's wearing a mask. And then the problem that I had with Rav Yosef is I was going to say, well, then if you say you see him as a thief, then just pay the principal back. Then how do you say you get off the hook if you take an oath by saying it's an unavoidable accident? You can't have it both ways. Now, a buyer is bringing something similar here, different but similar, and he's saying, look, the first thing of it is in Bava Kamma 41b, is there's a case where the Chumash is stating that if you misappropriated an item, logic would dictate that if, as an unpaid custodian, even if the Chumash didn't mention a paid custodian and it only mentioned an unpaid custodian, if you're off the hook, either as a paid custodian or an unpaid custodian for an avoidable mishap, an unavoidable mishap, because you couldn't help it. Being robbed at gunpoint is different to losing or having an object stolen because there's not enough security. If you've got a Class A security and somebody puts a gun to that person's head, they're obviously going to let the person into Fort Knox. That's not negligence, guys, in any way. So therefore, an armed robber, even a paid custodian, is off the hook. He doesn't want to lose his life. It's not like he was negligent in his security. Do you get what I'm saying? So the Chumash, this Bava Kamma argument is saying, look, even if the Chumash didn't use the word paid custodian, but it said unpaid custodian, logic would have told us that since a paid custodian is responsible for loss of theft and is off the hook for an unavoidable mishap, if he misappropriates the item, he's definitely liable. Because if an unpaid custodian that's not responsible for theft or loss misappropriates the item, is now liable for an unavoidable mishap. The paid custodian, who is even more responsible, is obviously liable for the same thing. So that's fine. So that's in the Chumash. But there's a brisa that seems to say something a little bit different to Bava Metzia. And this is a bias proof. He said, no, if you say that the stringency applies to the unpaid custodian who also possesses the stringency that he makes a twofold payment, will you say that it applies to the paid custodian who does not make the twofold payment? So here the Bryce is arguing with this thing in Bava Metzia and saying, look, an unpaid custodian seems to be more stringent than a paid custodian, because if you're caught lying and you use the item for personal use, as an unpaid custodian, you're paying double. Whereas as a paid custodian, you're just paying the principal back. So if that's the case, this is an argument against Rav Yosef, because what would happen then is it's saying that in all cases, the unpaid custodian that's caught lying has to take an oath or pay, and if he's caught out, he pays double, whereas the paid custodian just pays the principal. But Abai is still saying, but if you should think that an armed robber is a thief, it emerges that there is a case where a paid custodian would make the twofold payment, namely where he makes a claim of theft against the armed bandit. So what he's saying is that the Kol V'chomer is based on the premise that the paid custodian is treated more stringently than the unpaid custodian. And the Brisa argues that this isn't always true, because we find that the unpaid custodian must make the twofold payment if he swears that the deposit was stolen and is then found in his possession, whereas the paid custodian doesn't incur this penalty. And it says, although the stringency is relatively minor, it still proves that an unpaid custodian in a certain case is more stringent than a paid. And as explained earlier, a paid custodian who falsely swears that the deposit was seized by an armed bandit does make the twofold payment, provided that an armed bandit is deemed a thief as opposed to a robber. This brisa implies that a paid custodian never incurs this penalty, even if he claims to have been the victim of an armed bandit, and it must classify an armed bandit as a robber. This contradicts Rav Yosef's position that he's a thief. Can you see? Okay. So it's saying that a paid custodian only ever has to pay the principal back, which is less stringent, it seems, than the twofold payment. So this is a proof. If you only have to pay the principal back, then in fact, an armed robber is considered not a thief, but what do you call it? An unavoidable mishap, an honest. Because that's exactly a proof against Rav Yosef. Okay? So Rav Yosef has to respond. What does he respond? He says to Abai, this is what the Bryce is saying. No, if you say that the stringency applies to the unpaid custodian, who also possesses the stringency that he makes a twofold payment for all of his false claims of theft. Will you say that it applies to the paid custodian who does not make the twofold payment, except where he makes a false claim of theft by an armed bandit? So what he's saying is that doesn't prove that it's an unpaid custodian. That only proves that as far as the unpaid custodian is concerned, Gav?
Yeah.
Rav Yosef is saying, look, this only proves that an unpaid custodian, in all cases of theft where he made a false claim, he has to make the double payment. Whereas the paid custodian, only when he claims that it's an armed robber, at which case he's off the hook as a unavoidable mishap, is that when he's found to be lying, that he would have to pay the double payment, because I consider the robber, an armed robber, a thief. So he was saying only in that case is a paid custodian as stringent. In all other cases, an unpaid custodian is more stringent. So he's not arguing with the Brisa. It's just me saying a particular case. Now, we've got 7 minutes left. We'll be able to finish this. Abaya issues another challenge to Rav Yosef's classification from an armed bandit as a thief. He challenged him from the following brisa. It's the same logic, guys, but it's a different brisa. In the passage about one who borrows an animal, the Torah says, if it suffers a broken limb or dies, he shall surely pay. I've established from this verse only that a borrower is liable when the person suffers a broken limb or dies, which is an unavoidable accident. From where can I derive that he's liable for theft and loss as well? You may state a kol v'chomer argument to derive this law as follows. Since a paid custodian who the Chumash exempts from liability when the animal suffers a broken limb or dies because it's a unavoidable accident, is nonetheless liable for the theft and loss, then regarding a borrower who is liable when the animal suffers a limb or dies, an unavoidable accident, is it not logical there's liable for theft and loss because that's an avoidable accident? Having used this kol v'chomer to establish the borrower's liability for theft and loss, the Brisa adds, and this is a kol v'chomer that is not subject to refutation. So all it's saying is here, same as it said before with the unpaid custodian and the paid, a borrower is liable for unavoidable mishaps, and therefore it's obvious for things that are avoidable, he's even more liable because he's been done a massive favor by the person that lent the item. Whereas a paid custodian, even though he's gotten paid, he's doing the person a favor because the person is leaving for Australia and needs his goods looked after. Not that he's good looking, good to look after. Sorry, my tongue got twisted. All right. So a buyer develops his challenged. Now, if you should think that an armed bandit is a thief, why is it not subject to a refutation? There are grounds to refute it as follows. What proof can be drawn from the paid custodian who pays the twofold payment should make a false claim of theft by an armed bandit? In this respect, the paid custodian is treated more stringently than the borrower who never makes the twofold payment. So what he's saying is here, guys, this is an argument against Rav Yosef. If you're saying that the borrower is treated more stringently, and Rav Yosef is saying that, no, there's a twofold payment by a paid custodian who calls an armed robber a thief, then when he's caught out lying, he has to pay the twofold payment, where a borrower only has to pay back the principal. So this is going against the kol v'chomer, because the kol v'chomer is saying that the borrower, no matter what, has to just pay the principal. Whereas here, Rav Yosef is saying the paid custodian, if something unavoidable had to happen and he was caught lying, like an armed robber, he has to pay back double. So this is going against the kol v'chomer, which is irrefutable. So this is a proof that a buyer is treating against Rav Yosef. Okay, so in other words, he's saying that if you say that the kol v'chomer is irrefutable, you must hold that either the twofold payment is not paid on the custodian either. In other words, he's saying, Rav Yosef, if you are arguing with the Brisa, it's wrong. But if you're agreeing with the Brisa, it's proving that there's no twofold payment, which means that in that particular case, that even if the deposit was stolen by an armed bandit and was found to have kept it himself, he wouldn't incur the twofold payment. Why? Because it can be only that the armed bandit is classified as a robber. So he's saying that an armed bandit can't be classified as a thief. So the Rav Yosef responds, he says to Abai, this Tana of the Brisa maintains that the preceding argument about the twofold payment does not refute the kol v'chomer, because one who must pay the principal even without having taken a false oath is subject to a greater stringency than one who must pay twofold only after having taken a false oath and being contradicted by two witnesses. So what he's saying is, look, a borrower is always treated more stringently than a paid custodian, as evidenced by the law requiring to pay in the event of an unavoidable mishap, even if he hadn't taken any false oath. The premise holds true despite the fact that only the paid custodian is subject to the twofold payment. In other words, he's saying that the twofold payment doesn't demonstrate about relative responsibility as a custodian. He said it's a payment for swearing falsely. He said they're two separate issues. So what Rav Yosef is saying is that you're trying to say that if you pay more, it's more stringent. He's saying, no, why are you paying more is because you lied. the fact of it is that a paid custodian is more stringent than an unpaid, and a borrower is more stringent than a paid custodian, and your level of responsibility goes up the more the person is doing you a favor. But that has nothing to do with the fact that you're suddenly paying more because you were caught lying. That doesn't mean that somebody that's unpaid is treated more stringently than somebody that's paid. What it means is that the one's a liar and the one is not. You got punished for lying, not because there's a higher degree of payment and responsibility for an unpaid custodian compared to a paid, or paid compared to a borrower. He says it's not about the payment. He said, what are you paying for? Are you paying for lying, or are you paying for the fact of the responsibility you failed to adhere to? They're two separate issues. That's it.
Damon, I think, just to add a comment, if you paid custodian, usually I think 90% of the time would be honest. I don't think that problem would come. He would make a false statement. I think usually they would be, most of the time would be honest and return the object at the right time and look after it as best as possible.
Yeah, listen, I agree with you. Most people are honest, but the court's still a fool.
Paid custodians, though. That's what.
I don't think it would make any difference, paid or unpaid.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
The truth of it is, somebody's honest, they're honest. Kevin, I don't think your honesty would change whether you paid for a task or not. You're an honest person. How would that change? You're honest. Inevitably, it has to do with your character, not about your responsibility.
How come you didn't use me as an example for that specific example about being honest?
Because you never had a problem with it.